There's no doubting what you've achieved on a technical level. Secret of the Mimic is clearly state-of-the-art. There are just some lore implications that were made in this game that we don't fully understand. We were hoping you could shed some light on those. It's got rogue programming. It brings back possession. It has a deep and compelling narrative that builds up a part of the series we've yet to fully explore. It gives context for many of the things we hadn't shown yet in Security Breach. It even disconnects the book and game timelines to finally settle the debate of them being one-to-one with each other. With all due respect, those aren't the lore implications we were curious about, Steelwool.
Hello everyone, I am Freya, and like many of you, I just got done playing Secret of the Mimic for the first time. Well, not really, I started writing this a couple days ago. Now, judging by the title, you might think that I did not enjoy it, and believe me, it's quite the opposite. On many levels, I think Secret of the Mimic is the best game that Steelwool has ever released. And despite the many bugs, soft locks, and broken sequences I experienced during my first playthroughs,
again? What are the odds?
I still enjoyed my time playing it. That is, until I started to get a fuller understanding of what the game had to say for the lore. And before I go any further, I'm just going to say this as a general spoiler warning. I will be talking about what happens in the game, so if you would like to experience it for yourself, play it first and then come back. With that out of the way, there's a good chance those of you watching haven't seen my first video from before the game came out. And while, clearly, the information presented is now outdated, the conclusions I drew about the position I predicted we'd be in still very much apply to what I will be saying here. So, if you'd like some background on how I'm approaching the game and my criticisms of it, I'd recommend checking that out first. It should be in the info card if I can figure that out. Now, it would be poor sportsmanship for me to not address the Edwin in the room, especially since my last video. Yes, he's in the games now. However, I regret to inform those of you who are Tales games enjoyers, but
he's gone! Let's go!
If you somehow don't know, towards the end of the game we hear my personal favorite audio log, where M2 gives one of the best villain monologues I've ever heard.
Test. Journal entry. Too bad the new power test was a failure. Due to a minor detonation, there is damage to my office interior, as well as a small fire.
Help! M2! Respond! Emergency! Call for help!
Daddy's busy, buddy. Why don't you go outside and play?
I can't move. I can't feel my legs.
You know, speaking of legs, what do you think? I just finished mine.
I lost my temper. I was always gonna fix you. M2, respond.
Oh, can't right now, buddy. We can do something fun tomorrow. I promise. Ask your mom if she's not busy.
But we also hear Edwin, who sounds severely wounded or at least trapped somehow. While it's not outright said, the fact that Edwin is completely MIA after this event, it's not a far stretch to say that M2 killed him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why is this so important? Why am I so happy about Edwin most likely being dead? It's because he deserves it. It's because it not only deconfirms the Tales books being canon to the games, but it opens up so many opportunities for the lore. With Edwin out of the way, and much of what happens being mostly self-contained, we now have the freedom to use what this game shows us to explain things from the Scott era of games without altering their context. So with that being said, what does this game do to help explain the games? Honestly, quite a lot. The most obvious confirmation this game gives us is that Edwin Murray was the creator of the Springlock suits, which, in all fairness, makes sense. They're very different to one of Henry's, or what we assume are Henry's, animatronics. And William's Funtime animatronics are distinctly different as well. With Edwin being the one to have made the more rudimentary suit-like versions of animatronic, we now have a solid understanding of their 3 unique styles when creating animatronics. It also makes sense then that Edwin would create the mimic endoskeleton to fit any suit, because then you would only need one endoskeleton for any costume, and that could be for a normal costume or for the springlock suits. It's versatile, convenient, and most importantly, cost-effective. And if there's one thing that Edwin loves, it's firing workers to save money.
David, I want to introduce you to someone. This is M1. It can fit into any costume we've created. Think of it as your new babysitter. But it doesn't get paid and go home. It'll stay with us and help around the house.
I have great news, admins. Say hello to Dolly. She can work an unlimited number of hours without breaks or mealtime, always with a smile on her face. Just imagine the money we'll save. You can begin laying off the sorting staff as more dolly tracks are installed throughout the lower levels.
However, there are some interesting quirks about these springlock suits that are worth mentioning. When we were first introduced to springlock suits, we were told that their entire purpose was to be a fully functional animatronic that could also be worn as a suit. However, the springlocks we see in Secret of the Mimics seem very much like a more mechanized suit than anything else. This seems like a very clear contradiction between something like the Springtrap suit and the springlocks we use in this game. I've even seen people use this discrepancy as evidence that the springlock suits that come after are more dangerous or were made worse as a cost-saving measure. However, I not only think that would be unnecessary, but I also think there's something a little different that Steelwool was trying to establish. That being that the springlocks are incapable of moving on their own. The biggest indication for this comes with both Nurse Dolly and Jackie. I believe it makes the most sense that these animatronics would be springlock suits, as M2 enters and leaves them normally like any other suit. However, these suits both move differently while not being worn. Jackie obviously should be contained to her box, and someone wearing her suit would be stationary operating it. Nurse Dolly, on the other hand, is confined to a powered rail when not worn, and it's likely a person could remove it and wear it in the same way the Mimic does, except, without ripping it off the rails. Speaking of the powered rail, it's worthwhile to mention that all springlock suits need their mechanisms to be powered in order to function at all. We see this most obviously when putting together the Captain, where we must energize the suit before wearing it. Now, we don't know exactly what is being used to power the suit, or how a person could use an electrified suit without being electrocuted, but keep that in mind for later. With all this in mind though, it would seem to fit well with Edwin's other designs. It would make these springlocks basically larger mechanical puppets, which fit the theme of the rest of the costumes we see in the manor. Lastly, this game canonized the justification for the springlock suits sometimes failing, and the main cause being moisture. It's something most of the fanbase has accepted at this point, but it's nice to finally have it stated directly. However, if Edwin and his staff knew about the issue with moisture causing springlock failures, it makes you wonder how William didn't ultimately see the issue with wearing the spring Bonnie suit that ultimately became his Cawthon. Maybe he was just not thinking clearly, or thought the springlocks would hold, but with this being basically common knowledge, it's a little harder to believe he wouldn't have known it was a bad idea. Real quick, I just want to pop in here to clarify that I think Steelwool is trying to establish here that the springlock suits were always safer than we assumed them to be. I've seen a lot of people talking about us falling through the ceiling and not getting springlock failure, and using it as evidence that Edwin's were built better, or that Fazbear's were built worse, but I think these things are just bad at handling moisture. And that's what the main design flaw has always been with them. Honestly, William probably wouldn't have thought a springlock failure would be that bad, as many other employees had survived them before, and definitely would not have expected it to kill him. What I think ultimately caused William's death was that he did not account for how long that suit had been accumulating moisture, and how likely it would be for multiple simultaneous springlock failures, as we've heard described by Ralph before. However, there is still the issue of how springlocks have been described previously, being stated that they have endoskeletons that move out of place when cranked back. However, my guess is that Steelwool might be trying to say they worked a little different, or that the majority of springlock suits did not function in this way. Speaking of William, let's talk about what we find out about him and his relationship with Edwin, shall we? We don't get much information about the relationship between Fazbear Entertainment and Murray's Costume Manor, or rather, William and Henry's relationship with Edwin, but what we do get is quite impactful. While it seems like MCM had a business relationship with Fazbear's for quite a while, having seemingly had significant enough involvement in Fredbear's family diner to put its posters up in the factory itself, Edwin believed he, William, and Henry were bros. However, he would come to realize that they weren't actually bros, they were BROs. And because of this, he did not realize that the project he was working on for them was not meant to save his business, but to steal it out from under him. At least not until it was too late. But what was this project? Well, it seems to be what we encounter after we run parachute.exe and descend the elevator in the welcome show area. But I'll talk about that in a minute. There are a few things we can discern about William, Henry, and their business from this information alone. For one, seemingly both William and Henry would have been privy to this plan, as Henry is the one to give Edwin the change orders.
Test. Journal entry. I got the change order from Hen last night. None of this makes sense. I'm almost done. Why change it now? It would be so much easier to keep using the spring locks. Just hire some teens to wear the suits like we always do.
William could have also done this, or made it worse, but Henry is included on these change orders and would have known why they were giving so many, unless William is just very good at hiding things from Henry, but that's something we've yet to see. This would mean Henry was aware that they were planning to steal Edwin's work from him. Now, as much as I love Henry, he is a flawed person, so this would make sense. However, there's a chance he was not in agreement with this plan and that William was the one pushing it so heavily. This would correlate with the logs we see from WA, where he pretends to offer condolences and compensation to Edwin.
Software development and the entire MCM catalog. We would love to keep you on as a lead engineer, although we now technically own the land. We would never touch the house your parents built. We feel this offer has been more than fair, considering how far behind you are. It's just too much for you to handle alone. We are waiting for your response. WA.
Which he doesn't do, but we'll get to that. WA had been poaching employees from MCM by offering double the salary, and even asked Edwin for the full staff contact list in exchange for letting him manage a new franchise location.
We are almost there. I need the rest of the Murray staff contact info. The sooner the better. You get that from me, and I can sweeten the deal. How would you like to manage one of the new franchise locations? WA.
With how William is trying to seem gracious and forgiving here, it's possible Henry was not aware of the full extent of William's plans for MCM, and William was spearheading the decisions that would lead to its downfall. Again, Henry could be in on all of it, but judging by previous understandings of the dynamic between William and Henry, there's a decent chance that William was doing this manipulation mostly in secret. But what was that he said earlier? Manager of a franchise location? Now, hold up. Which location? It could be Fredbear's, but that doesn't seem quite right. A family diner doesn't sound like something that would be a nationwide franchise, even though it is likely that they did eventually get multiple locations. But what other locations could there possibly be at this point in the timeline? Oh yeah. So after we see the goodbye show and give one final farewell to Big Top, we are taken to the R&D department. Down there, we find a couple things. One being a giant Freddy head, which is similar to the giant Freddy head in the sinkhole of the Pizzaplex. Also the giant moon head from Showroom 1, honestly. The other is an entire prototype Freddy Fazbear's pizza location. The layout of this place is nearly identical to the FNAF 1 location, even including the safe room, with a few notable exceptions. The main difference in this location is the inclusion of the Monty, Bub, Spring Bonnie, and Fredbear Springlock suits, as well as minor modifications to the size and features of each room. Notably, these are not the Springlock suits we would have seen previously, but we'll get into that later. With how important this area is, it's reasonable to assume that this entire place is the Fazbear Project. Before this point, it's unlikely Fazbear Entertainment would have had the reach a typical franchise would need. This prototype Edwin was working on would therefore be the template that the company could use to sell franchise locations all across the country. This would also make sense seeing as it is directly beneath the Welcome Show area. Perhaps this place would be the final stop on the tour for potential buyers. If nothing else caught your attention, how would you like to be able to run and manage your own business? Which also, in that context, makes what William offers Edwin so much more evil.
We are almost there. I need the rest of the Murray staff contact info. The sooner the better. You get that for me, and I can sweeten the deal. How would you like to manage one of the new franchise locations? WA.
Just gonna put a note here. After looking at this a little bit more, and also seeing a theory on Raito's channel, I don't think this log is actually talking to Edwin, and I think it might actually be talking to Henry instead. Go check out the theory on Raito's channel if you want to hear more about it. But I'm like 99% sure that this is who this is actually to instead of Edwin, so sorry about that. But while this is the kind of Freddy's locations we might expect at a glance, there are clear differences in the characters present here. There's the Golden Duo, of course, which may or may not be included in a typical franchise location. Maybe not as main cast, but sort of a guest appearance if a staff member needed to use a Springlock suit when the other animatronics weren't in service. However, there's also Monty and this Bub character. I'm gonna be honest, I think the dog is dumb, and a weird pull when Monty and Roxy are already established characters. I know, it's probably a reference to Sparky, and it looks very similar to the dog costume from the movie, honestly, but it still was weird to just add random dog to this game. However, it does make sense why the additional characters are here. As this is supposed to be a franchised location, Edwin and Fiona likely wanted to add the most popular of their characters to the Freddy's band. This would make sense with the bedtime story we see in the secret ending.
There you are. Do you remember how our story begins? Once upon a time. That's right. A wily fox buckled swashes in his pirate ship. Isn't that nice? They all started a band and lived happily ever after. The end.
Which, if that's the case, are any of the main cast actually William or Henry's characters? Secret of the Mimic added a ton of new characters to this franchise, which makes sense with it mainly being a costume factory. But we also got a lot of context as to where each of the main cast started out. One of the biggest reveals was Foxy, who was actually part of his own pirate crew. And while he was not yet the captain we've come to love, he does appear to be the main character, along with Deadeye Roxy, who we now know went through major revamping after she was made into one of the Glamrocks. Speaking of, our other Glamrock, Monty, seems to be very different from how we know him. And this version of him would seem to more accurately reflect his origin story that Ruin shows us. This kind of redesign reminds me a little of Chuck E. Cheese mascot change, actually, where they went away from this giant, iconic rat and made him a tiny, hip, cool, but honestly kind of cringy teen.
Poggers!
We've discussed Bub already, but this perhaps could be another character that was quite successful. It almost seems like they might be related to Sharpay's Salon, or that they had a whole cast of dog characters. Or Bub could be part of Monty's crew, which would make sense why they are the only other Springlocks down there besides the Golden Children. Next is Chica. This one is perhaps the most obvious of the bunch, as we are finally shown Chica's party world in this game, which is awesome, although we are not explicitly told who owns Chica's party world. In the log talking about it, they are only referred to as the client, and the commercial is simply shown as its own thing, not specifically from Murray Co. This is also the only one of these commercials to not be included in the MCM archive teasers for Secret of the Mimic. Oh yeah, and that one. Now, it is quite clear that Chica is Fiona's character, but the client could still be someone other than Fazbear Entertainment. That being said, to be included as part of the band, Fazbear would most likely need to be involved in some way. Or they just stole it once they acquired MCM's assets, which is also on brand. I have more thoughts on this, but that would have to be another video, so for now let's just assume Chica's party world is firmly something either Edwin, Henry, William, or some combination of them had a hand in. That leaves us with Freddy and Bonnie. Now, let's look at Freddy and Bonnie together. I think it was assumed by many, but at least by me, that Freddy and Bonnie began as the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza version of the Fredbear's characters, with their designs being altered to fit a more realistic version of both the animals and characters they represent. That may still be the case, however, with the majority of the original band now consisting of Edwin and Fiona's characters, or at least characters Fiona helped design, the possibility now exists that these two had a slightly different origin. One where their characters were part of something much different before they took their place on stage. One that pulls from something we've seen previously. That's right, I'm talking about... Back in the days before the release of Security Breach, we got a couple teasers for the game showcasing an old cartoon called Freddy and Friends on Tour. Oh, to be in a time where people were excited for Security Breach again. These showed a progressively deteriorating cartoon show in addition to a character reveal at the end of each.
Are you having fun yet?
However, looking back, what do these cartoons actually show us? For one, they are obviously repetitive in nature, with the same events happening in all but one, with minor changes like setting and switching who talks to Foxy. However, they all end with a different jingle. It almost seems like these cartoons were made as an advertisement for the new Fazbear's Pizza locations. This would very much explain why these cartoons were formatted in this way. But the content of the cartoons seemed fitting for this as well. The main plot of each one shows the main three trying to recruit Foxy into the band. This establishes a couple things. One, that Chica was important enough to automatically be included with Freddy and Bonnie, also implying Chica's party world to be the most successful of the other ventures MCM and Fazbear took part in. The other is that Foxy was an outsider, but popular enough to serve as his own feature character apart from the main three. Also, he's been promoted to captain now. Lastly, in the first three, we see the gang capture Foxy and pull off his mask, revealing an endoskeleton underneath. This too could be a facet of what was being advertised. These locations would most likely have been the first to use fully autonomous animatronic characters, as Chica's party world was just somebody in a costume on roller skates, and the Springlocks were just slightly more complex suits that ultimately still needed a performer inside at most times. Kind of a weird way to advertise that, but this is presumably the same people that thought this was okay.
How they know they're tough. How they know they're tough. How they know they're tough.
However, there's another aspect of these videos that always bugged me, but I think I finally have an explanation for it. With the title Freddy and Friends, it always seemed to be strange that it wasn't instead something else, something we've already seen before.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier.
No, not that. I am talking about this. It always seemed obvious to me that Freddy and Friends was in reference to this TV show we see in the FNAF 4 minigame, Fredbear and Friends. However, I thought it was just a nod to something we already knew. But maybe these are more connected than we thought. For one, let's look at the dates. Assuming the on-tour commercials were for this Fazbear project and that Secret of the Mimic takes place in 1979, it's likely these commercials will be coming out around the same time, or slightly before. With Fredbear and Friends, we get the date 1983, which is the main reason we knew that this was not
The Bite of 87?
Now, there's nothing saying when these Freddy Fazbear's locations would have started this ad campaign, but we at least have a window between 1979 and 1983 for these on-tour commercials. That being said, why would they use these as commercials? Well, maybe they weren't explicitly commercials. Maybe they really were a cartoon show. A previously established cartoon show with previously established characters. It always seemed odd that the Fredbear and Friends show seemed to both have Freddy and Bonnie alongside Fredbear, but maybe they were there first. Maybe the origin of Freddy and Bonnie as characters was this Freddy and Friends show. With all the characters at MCM's and therefore Fazbear's disposal, it would make sense for them to start a cartoon series to get some value from the IP that they otherwise wouldn't be using. Reminds me of a certain other rodent mascot.
Hey everybody, it's me. You want to come inside my clubhouse? Well, all right.
Perhaps Fazbear introduced this show as a way to familiarize the public with these two new bear and bunny characters, as well as the other cast that they might find at one of their franchise locations. This might also mean that Freddy and Friends predates Fredbear and Friends, with that instead being a spin-off or continuation that would include the original Fredbear and Spring Bonnie characters, perhaps after they were officially added alongside Freddy's cast at the pizzeria locations. This would also help explain why Fredbear's Family Diner would be around in the 70s, be absent from Freddy and Friends, but still have Freddy and Bonnie featured in Fredbear and Friends in 1983. However, there is another question about these characters that Secret of the Mimic poses, perhaps unintentionally. If this is 1979, before the main band was official, why is it still Fazbear Entertainment? Either Freddy Fazbear predates Fredbear, Fredbear's full name is Fredbear Fazbear, or something else is happening here. Again, this seems like a topic best saved for another video, but it was something I needed to mention. Anyways, did you guys notice that David's bedroom looks a lot like the FNAF 4 bedroom? Edwin's house is a very interesting place, not just because of the chains hanging everywhere and the security-protected metal doors all over the place, but because of its relation to the factory. Here we have a factory owned by Fazbear, as well as a house very nearby directly connected to this factory. And although our buddy Willie A said he wouldn't touch the house, after Edwin disappears, he absolutely would have. Prospect of having a house so close and directly connected to one of his factories would be too perfect to not make use of. Now, where else in the series have we seen a house on a hill that connected to a large underground bunker where William Afton would have stored things away he didn't want getting out into the world? Oh, it's right behind me, isn't it? Obviously, this seems like it's very connected to FNAF 4 and therefore sister location. It seems very likely that Secret of the Mimic takes place on the same spot where the FNAF 4 house and sister location bunker would be. And if not, I don't know how many more cover buildings with secret underground architecture connected to another building I can take at this point. But more than that, David's room is the most interesting of any part of the house, as it very much resembles the FNAF 4 bedroom and even has some of the same toys lying around. Notably though, the layout of this room is not the same as in FNAF 4. However, with everything here being so similar, I think it's close enough that we can chalk up the difference to some later renovations made by William to better fit his uses. Again, this is a much larger topic that I could dive into, although I'll probably leave that to someone else, as I'm not particularly apt at discerning the many inconsistencies of the architecture present in these games. That being said, I think it's time we take a look at the biggest thing to potentially make the lore of this game impact the rest of the series, and that's... Yeah, it's about time I mentioned this bitch. Sorry, I mean these bitches. Because as we found out, the secret of the Mimic, or at least one of them, was that there were two of them, M1 and M2. M1, or Fiona, or F10N4, or Sun, or Mexis, or whatever you want to call it, is the first version of this Mimic that we encounter. But we don't know it yet, as it pretends to be Dispatch for most of the game. Now, before I get into what the game tells us about M1, I want to talk about something I mentioned in my last video. In that video, I speculated that the main difference between the book and game timelines was the presence, or lack thereof, of the Mexis machine. And boy does it feel good to be vindicated. While it's not entirely clear if Edwin actually dies, we do get a clear discrepancy with the time and place of death for Fiona. In the books, it said Fiona dies at childbirth, although it's clear that in this game she dies at Fall Fest. And I will not be entertaining anything else, because they all but state it directly at multiple points. Perhaps this difference is also the key reason why M1, or Mexis, seems to not be present in the books. Either because Edwin did not try to resurrect Fiona, or he was unable to. However, if that is the case, the question would then be, why not? I believe it is because both M1 and M2, or at least the Mimic endoskeleton, is being possessed in some capacity. And I do think it's likely by Fiona. One big argument against this I've seen is that Fiona dying at Fall Fest would make it impossible to possess M1. However, I don't think that is the case. As we learn in the story Alone Together, a spirit will wander the places they knew when they were alive until their body is discovered, believing they are still alive. However, Fiona likely would have been discovered in the ashes, but we also learn that spirits can choose to stay and not move on. I believe that if Fiona were to die in childbirth, as in the books, she might not have stuck around. However, dying in the Fall Fest fire might have caused her to want to stay. This is why the spirit box Edwin sets up works. and it's why M1 is able to replicate Fiona despite not having anything to base her personality on. Beyond just speculation, though, I think there's a more obvious reason for why these mimics must be possessed in some way. We hear directly from Edwin that he is unable to make M2 at first, and if it was using the same program, there should be no issue with it working in the same way, yet it fails. I think this is as close to confirmation as we could ask for that something supernatural was the key for the success of M1 and subsequently M2. In M2's case, I'm not convinced it has to be David possessing him, but I still think it's at least partly him in the same way that the other possessed animatronics don't act like themselves, and rather the characters. Speaking of, what would this mean for the other possessed characters in the series? Well, if the key to M1 and M2's success was possession, it makes things a lot simpler. Let's be honest, I don't think Edwin was out here making full-on ChatGPT in the 1970s, but perhaps the learning aspect of the code is all he needed. If he programmed the mimic to simply copy everything it saw, it might not be able to store this information anywhere, or at least it would struggle interpreting things. However, if a soul possessed it, that soul would provide the consciousness, memory, and the spark of life the base code needed, while still following the rules the code lays out. We already know that possessed animatronics are still subject to their programming, as Springtrap in FNAF 3 is forced to follow the audio lures due to the programming of the suit he resides in. I believe it is similar for the mimic, in that the soul is still required for it to function, but is still compelled to copy what it sees. This would explain why Fiona's personality changes slightly as well, since she would be operating as a more idealized version of herself that Edwin would have wanted. Why do some of you like this guy again? But the main reason I believe they are trying to say possession is still required is because it's the only way the rest of the series makes sense. At this point, in 1979, Fazbear Entertainment, and therefore William, would have access to the Mimic program, or the Mimic would be loose depending on which ending happens. Regardless, it exists and they know about it. If this were the case and possession was not necessary, why would William have ever started killing in the first place? However, if there was another reason Edwin's creations were so successful, maybe it would provide that reason. Maybe there was a presence of a certain energy, or perhaps a substance, that was the key to everything. Perhaps a substance residing within the metal itself that could be melted down, recycled, and pumped all over Edwin's factory. But that couldn't be... Holy shit, is that f***ing Remnant? I don't know why I haven't seen more people losing it over this, but can we be so for real right now? That is Remnant. On my first playthrough, I was almost certain that they directly said it, but I must have misheard dispatch in the first room where you encounter it. But what else could this possibly be? It's a molten fluid that seems to be sourced from all of the metal thrown into the furnace. And I don't know if you know this, but pumping molten metal into something on its own does not work as a power source. It also looks incredibly similar to the remnant we've seen in the graphic novels for the Silver Eyes trilogy. This stuff seemingly powers the entire factory, and is the real reason for Edwin's recycling initiative. He needs to be able to reclaim and reuse the remnant put into each of these robots, both because it is a valuable and finite resource, but also because it would be bad news if it got away from him. And now we finally arrive at the reason for the title of this video. This is a game changer, and in some very problematic ways. If this really is remnant, which it very much seems to be...
Why does Edwin have so much of it? How does he have this much of it? How many hundreds of people would it take to fill up these pipes alone? How would Edwin be able to just freely use this as a power source without anyone questioning it? What the fuck?
Sorry, I got a little worked up there for a second. I will say, while I am almost fully convinced that this fluid has to be remnant, I do not believe it is likely that Edwin knew it was, or at least what it really was. While I hate Edwin, and will until the end of my days, a killer he is not, and neither is he someone who would be fine knowingly using souls to power his machines. So where would this remnant have come from? And more importantly, who collected it? William is the obvious first choice, but at this point it's unlikely he would know about Remnant either. But even if he did, MCM and Fazbear's business relationship does not seem to have gone that deep that William would be able to just provide this as a power source just as a gift to his partner. We've seen how William chooses to use Remnant in the past, or future now I guess, and he is not one to risk anyone finding out how the sausage was made. Henry obviously isn't the one either for the previous reasons, as well as Henry not being a killer either. So if Edwin didn't do it, and Henry didn't do it, and William didn't do it, then who's watching Foxy? But seriously, where could this much remnant have come from? Well, our Edwin here wasn't the first of his name.
I was the first. I have seen everything.
No, not you. Get out of here. I'm talking about Edwin's father. A surprising aspect of this game's story was the brief mention of Edwin's father during a few of the audio logs. Basically, Edwin Murray Sr., thanks Steelwool, owned and ran MCM before our Edwin did, and he gave it to his son upon his passing. We mostly get this information to show what Edwin was doing before he was the one in charge, and how things changed after he was given the helm. However, it is a notable inclusion, especially if he was the source of all this remnant. But even so, how would this be possible? Edwin's father is most likely not a serial killer. Like all good CEOs, he would have had to find a way to kill while keeping his hands clean. So most likely, this would have been accumulated over a larger span of time. And to do that, you would need a cover operation so that it couldn't be traced back to you if things went south. Some sort of long-standing, decentralized venue where people wouldn't notice a few missing guests, or where a few tragedies could be simply seen as unfortunate accidents. Perhaps a yearly event. Perhaps a festival. Perhaps a... We've heard a lot about Fall Fest, and it's becoming more and more important with each new release. With how much of a focus has been placed on it, I think it's possible we get a game entirely about it. Or perhaps another bigger inclusion when, or if, we get a Fredbear's game. If this power source is Remnant, I think it's likely that a Fall Fest game would show us the source, regardless of who is behind it. But what do we know about Fall Fest? Well, thanks to this game, we now know a lot more. For one, we know for certain that MCM was very heavily involved in Fall Fest, if not directly being the ones putting it on. We also know that there was a fire at least one of them that Fiona unfortunately died in. Fiona, according to Edwin, was not supposed to go, but Fiona for some reason felt like she needed to be there to help. We get a text log from an employee saying they think the fire was an insurance scam. However, the main reason for that seems to be because they were hearing M1 talking in Fiona's voice. As far as the contents of what was going on at Fall Fest, however, we still do not know. It is here, though, that I feel it necessary to mention what we already knew about Fall Fest before this game. The most we saw directly about a Fall Fest was in The Curse of Dreadbear, which seems to take place at or in the same place as Fall Fest 1983. However, in Help Wanted 2, we are able to get a poster that shows Fall Fest 1970. We know for almost a fact that neither of these are the Fall Fest which Fiona would have attended. 1983 is obviously too late for when this game takes place, but 1970 is just far enough away from 1979 for it to be almost impossible for that to be the one Secret of the Mimic is referring to. By just roughly working out dates, we can prove this. First, let's look at what we know for a fact. We know that Fiona dies before, or perhaps on, David's 3rd birthday. David is about 4 years old when he dies. However, the tapes seem to suggest he might have died on his 5th birthday, as each one is from a different year. But the last two could potentially be from the same day, as M1 is present in both. Realistically speaking, all the events after David's death would have likely happened fairly quickly, meaning at most 1 or 2 years between David's death and Edwin's death. Being as generous as possible, that would place Arnold arriving at the factory at most 6 months after that, but likely much sooner. We know the game takes place in 1979, so at the earliest, Fiona would have attended Fall Fest 1975. Or around there, but 1975 sounds better. Hi, editing Freya jumping in. Game Theory just released a theory and pointed out that there is a cake with 6 candles in one of the achievements, and also gives the justification of Edwin forgetting to tape a birthday when creating M1 for there being only 5 tapes, which honestly makes a lot of sense, and could shorten the gap between 1970 and 1979. This would still mean a 3 to 4 year gap between Edwin disappearing and Arnold finally showing up, which seems like a lot, but the time frame would be a little bit more malleable with that information. I will say though, once again, suck it, Tales Games enjoyers. Not really though, you are welcomed and appreciated. That being said, this doesn't really change much of my theory, just makes it possible that a Fall Fest game would directly show us the fire that kills Fiona, so disregard some of what I'm about to say here. This means we still have no idea what is so important about Fall Fest 1970. Perhaps it's not very important, and it was merely there to establish that it's a long-standing yearly event. But I think that date is very intentional. At the time of Help Wanted 2, it seemed almost too far back to matter. At that point, the earliest events in the series were happening 13 years after that. However, with Secret of the Mimic pushing us back just a little bit further, we now have a perfect time period for when Edwin and Fiona would have just been getting to know each other, or perhaps them being together at all. But more importantly, it would give us an opportunity to meet Edwin's father, and see what kind of a monster he really is. But there's another key factor of Fiona's Fall Fest taking place around 1975, and that's the fact that it didn't stop after that fire. They kept it running up until at least 1983. Of course, one incident does not mean the entire thing should stop forever, but what does it mean that the fire was not enough to get people to stop attending? Perhaps similar incidents, then, could have happened at previous Fall Fests. So with everything I've said, where does that ultimately leave us? Well, thankfully, not with broken lore. So I did bait you a little bit with that title. Again. But this does have big implications for the lore going forward, or more accurately, going backward. However, it seems like it's more so meant to skew into the direction of explaining how William even found out about Remnant in the first place. He likely wouldn't have known MCM had this power source at all, at least not until after the events of Secret of the Mimic. I do think that if this is Remnant, then it's likely that the ending where we run Cradle.exe is most likely. For all this Remnant to just be lying around, it would be meaningless for William to have ever killed anyone if he could have just gotten his hands on as much as he would ever need. However, if the whole building went up in flames, most if not all of the Remnant inside would likely have been destroyed or rendered unusable. In that case, he would be left with the question of what this stuff even was, and how could he get his hands on more of it? As far as Edwin and Edwin Sr., I am fairly certain this is not the last we'll hear about either of them in the games. I think Edwin Sr. being a figure we know so little about already feels like a mystery begging to be solved, and if the trend of bad dads is to continue, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Edwin Sr. would be a bad guy. However, I do feel like there's a chance Edwin is not as clueless as this game depicts him. The way he talks about Fiona being at Fall Fest sounds very suspicious, almost like he knew the fire was going to happen. So is there a chance when his father died he was let in on the family's secret recipe? I'm not sure, but I think it's possible. And while there is certainly a lot to talk about with M1, M2, and how what we learned affects the rest of the series, especially looking back on what happened in Security Breach and Ruin, I needed to look at things in the bigger picture. There's a lot this game presents us with, and the information we get can be applied to almost every part of the series. Knowing all that, I wanted to have another discussion going over the biggest things we learned and how I interpreted them. Again, most of this wasn't really a theory per se, but it's still a little too early for me to focus too heavily on one specific thing. Although I do have quite a few thoughts that I haven't even mentioned yet. Like seriously, what is the FNAF 3 map doing down in Proto Freddy's? And on that same note, I know it's kind of crazy for me to be focusing on what we might see in a game that's 2 or 3 releases down the line, but if you show me an awfully Remnant-looking mystery fluid, I'm not just going to ignore it. Now, there's obviously still the possibility that this is not Remnant and I'm losing my mind for no reason, but isn't that the point of FNAF theorizing at the end of the day? However, if this really is not Remnant, still will have some explaining to do. Because that's almost irresponsible how similar it is. But not only that, it would once again mean that this technology is able to be incredibly complex at a period where it really should not be, especially considering that the rest of the series does not share this level of complexity in their tech, at least not without a soul being present in some capacity. And with how often Edwin's inventions fail, I think it's unreasonable and almost irresponsible to assume that he made such a complex algorithm in the 70s. All that being said, I want to thank Steelwool. Secret of the Mimic was a great step forward in quality, both as a game and for the lore, and I'm excited to see what they'll work on next. I am genuinely stunned by how Steelwool managed to make a game so early in the timeline that seemingly doesn't break anything we already knew about this series, and have instead been able to expand upon some of the things we've yet to get answers for, especially since the ability for a mimic to exist at all, especially this early on, had incredible potential to ruin things or severely change them. However, if I may make a suggestion, I want the next games to have a little bit more of the FNAF gameplay loop included. A lot of people rightly pointed out this game does not feel like a FNAF game, at least not for the first 90% of it. With a completely unique cast, gameplay focused on mostly chases and puzzles, it felt much more similar to a Poppy Playtime game. Now, mind you, I say that with no disrespect. I like the Poppy Playtime games, and I think they made a great game using that formula, but they didn't make a FNAF game. Of course, the kind of game they were making wouldn't work as a typical sit-and-survive kind of gameplay loop, but I don't think FNAF needs to be that anymore. The genre has expanded so much thanks to fan games and other entries that try to do something similar. At this point, a free-roam FNAF game has been explored in many different ways. I mean, if Markiplier could feel it, then I think it'd be disingenuous to say that it's not worth discussing.
And I think when you look at this from that perspective, it's great. It is. It's awesome. But there's something missing, you know? I miss it. You know, when you have your favorite food from your childhood or something, and you're eating it, and you've been looking forward to it for a long time, you haven't had it in years, and then you go to take a bite, and you realize that they changed the recipe. And it's not that it's not good, but it's not what you've really wanted, you know? And it sucks to say that, and it probably sucks to hear that, but it's true. I'm not going to be dishonest here, and I don't even know if there's any value in what I'm saying, but, you know, I'm just speaking what I feel. So yeah, I think that's what I would equate it to. It's good. It is. Really well made. Like I said, the developer should be incredibly proud, and I hope they don't take anything from what I'm saying, because obviously I am not, as much as I joke about it, I'm obviously not an authority on anything that has to do with any of this old.
And I don't mention all this to talk bad about the game or use any point against it, although I know many do use it against it, but I, like many others, have been missing that core feeling of playing a FNAF game. And it seemed like Secret of the Mimic would have been the perfect opportunity to redefine the genre and give us something truly unique to kickstart a new era of FNAF games. If you're not with me, or you feel like you've heard this too many times to care anymore, let me just paint a picture of what Secret of the Mimic could have been.
I found you!
You find yourself on some catwalks. You stumble upon a control station with some monitors showing views of different vents. You hear dispatch coming over the speakers.
Hey, what are you doing back there? You shouldn't have access to that area. We're going to have to get you out of there. Fortunately, it's pretty simple. You just have to reset the ventilation system. That should give you enough time to make your way through. Unfortunately, though, the system has to go into a low power mode while undergoing the reset. Most of the vents have choke points to catch any debris that might be caught in them, for easier collection. These open up during your system reset, and gradually come back online. Now, if you go quick, you can probably make it out before any of them would block your path. However, if there happens to be something in there with you that you'd like to keep out, you might want to wait until a few of them come back online. You should still have enough time to make it before they all close up, but it will be tight. You can use that console in front of you to switch which vents are closed, but only so many can be closed at once, so choose carefully.
I found you!
Better get going.
It won't be long until it finds another way in. There were so many perfect opportunities in this game to add in sections where we would naturally transition into a FNAF style of gameplay, and Jackie is a prime example of this. I love Jackie. I think her voice lines are some of the most chilling in the whole game, but we barely get to see her. Even in her chase sequence, you don't have enough time to really get a good look at her, and you're going so fast that she keeps cutting off her own dialogue.
I want nice big slices.
This is my problem with chase sequences as well, because you either make them forgiving enough that they're not really challenging, or you make them too unforgiving and the chase gets boring because you have to keep resetting at every choke point. All the while, the coolest things your characters are doing won't be seen by half the people that play because they're running away. Just a few small changes to each of these chase sequences could have made them much more FNAF. Either before, after, or during these chases, we could have had these little pauses to play FNAF gameplay. And not only that, we would have gotten the chance to have a one-on-one with each of these characters that we don't otherwise get to see that much. Imagine if when we went up to the roof, we were able to lead Big Top out of our path with audio lures similar to the mini Music Men and Ruin, except this time it's one giant looming threat and not a bunch of annoying little guys that get caught between dimensions half the time. Or if that safe room in the admin wing had some sort of defense mechanism to lead Chica around you, so you didn't have to avoid the annoying cupcakes with way too big of a detection radius to get anywhere. Nurse Dolly had the most interesting moments and felt just a little more like FNAF when avoiding her, but even she could have had some slight tweaks to her sections that would have made them much closer to the FNAF gameplay loop. Again, all this isn't meant to disparage the game or steal wool in any way, but I do hope they take these criticisms into consideration when they make their next game or games. They've proven that they can make a great game, now they just need to show us that they can make a great FNAF game. I know I and a lot of other people would be really happy to see it. But anyways, I think that brings me to the end of this combo pack of a recap / discussion / theory / game review / info dump video. I think I like this more free-flowing kind of video structure, and I hope it wasn't too confusing jumping between these different topics / focal points all in the same video. I don't have the patience or the time to write out 4 different 10-minute videos and upload them in a timely manner, so you get the lightly structured info dump for now. I'm kind of treating my videos more like check-ins for the series as a whole when there's an important inflection point. And with the lead up to Secret of the Mimic, that definitely was an inflection point, as well as with where we are now. I would like to make my uploads more frequent, but I simply don't know if the inspiration will strike me or if time will allow it. But I'll try my best to keep up with it. I also have some other ideas besides theory videos floating around in my head, so maybe I'll get the chance to do some of those. There is one that I'm contractually obligated to make now, and I'm sure that will be coming out very soon. But if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment if you have something you'd like to add to the discussion. I'm always open to new ideas, and I love to hear other people's perspectives. This has been Freya. Bye-bye.
What's wrong with me? I don't feel like myself. Almost like I'm becoming someone else.
Back in the days before the release of Security Breach, we got a couple teasers for the game. Well, it was a game. We didn't quite get that game, but Security Breach. It was a game. WA also had been in poaching, like impeaching, like we should do to our president. I got water. Remember to drink water, everybody. It's very important. Freya says drink water. Or the world. I don't know. Maybe Fazbear's has gone international at this point. I don't know. It just seems like Fazbear's is getting bigger and bigger the farther back we go in the timeline, but whatever. The possibility now exists for the... I don't like speaking. It's hard. Why do I have to keep talking? Why can't I just think a video into existence?
Luckily, with the power of Copilot.
Also, I just want to mention that Edwin is notably a dumbass. Is it? Fucking Nepo baby. M2! M2! Please be gentle, M2. Let's cut to the bug of the week. David's room is the... But more than that, David... My name is David. Obviously, this seems like it's very connected to FNAF. Theorist FNAF. With all the characters at MCMs and therefore Fazbear's just Fazbear's. With this all in mind, though, it would seem to fit well with Hedwin. I'm just finding new ways to say their names wrong. Hedwin. Or rather, William Henry Edwin. Now, it is quite clear that Cheeker. Well, it seems to be what we see after we won powerthought.exe. I love powerthought.exe.
Software development and the entire MCM catalog.
Before this point, it's unlikely that Fazbear Entertainment would have had the reach a typical franchise would have need. There's the Golden Duo, of course. There's the Golden Duo, of course. I'm really becoming British now, damn. Heat from fire, fire from heat. Heat from fire, fire from heat. This would explain why Fiona's personality. This would explain why Fiona's personality changes slightly as well. I'm a voice actor, by the way. Please hire me. As this will be the... no... I love Pomni. Controversial take, I know. It's likely these commercials would be coming out at this... It's like these... Meow. 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 Anyways, did you guys notice that David... Loser City fucking interrupting my video by distracting me with hot women.